Now, here on Mastering Dungeons, we are going to get into our main topic. We are covering the Dungeon Master's Guide chapter by chapter. Last week, we looked at chapter 1, talking about creating your world and what goes into it. This week, we're going to talk about chapter 2, creating a multiverse. So, let's create a multiverse in chapter 2 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Teos, you did a little experiment. You want to talk about what you did?
I did, because I was thinking to myself, wow, really, chapter 2 is like build the multiverse? And so I went back and I said, well, what do all the chapter 2s look like in previous editions? And first edition doesn't really have chapters. It has just lots and lots of sections. But if you sort of think about what is in that sort of chapter 2 area, it's all about player characters and working with them. I was like, okay, interesting, cool. And I look at 2E, it's also about character races and species, how to work with them, how to create new ones. Third edition, same thing. What if you make a monster into a race? What if you do a race variant? What if you modify character classes or prestige classes? Like, wow, it's all about characters. And then I look at 3.5e, and that's the first divergence. In 3.5, it becomes using the rules is chapter 2. And it covers movement rules, evasion and pursuit, pacing, ability checks, rewards. It's really that kind of toolkit of scenarios that come up at the table. And then 4th edition digs into this and runs with it. Pacing, props, narration, dispensing information, improvising, really useful stuff. And even the 4E DMG 2 goes in and gives you lots of tools around advanced encounter design, player motivation, small, large groups, stuff like that. And so then I think, wow, how did we go from that history to the multiverse? So I just thought that was really interesting to think through that difference. And I think we're going to see it change again.
So that, yes, I think it's safe to say that we will see that change based on Chris Perkins's, talk. But since we're here, since we're spanning the multiverse, why don't we talk about what this chapter does? So it talks about, first, obviously, the planes, because they are going to set your world within the larger sphere of the entire universe, multiverse, however you want to describe it. And it starts by saying the planes. The various planes of existence are realms of myth and mystery. And I love to sort of take the first sentence and sort of break it down. And so the various planes of existence are realms of myth and mystery. Sure they are, but they're also not. The planes can be a place of myth and mystery. But if you put them in a book, especially in chapter 2 of a book that most people are probably going to buy and read, then they are no longer a mystery. The players know exactly what they are, know exactly what happens there. You know what also can be a place of myth and mystery? A village at the edge of the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
An underground city of myconids. Any place can be a place of myth and mystery if you set up the story to be one of myth and mystery, one of surprise, one of exploration and learning. Is it more likely that these planes will be a place of myth and mystery? Sure. But any place can be a place of myth and mystery if you work at it hard enough. And so that's, one thing about this chapter that caught my attention was it becomes less of a place of myth and mystery when you lay it all out and describe it in a book that probably most of the people are going to buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what really hits me about this chapter. This chapter is, like chapter 1, encyclopedic. It's got a lot of lore. It's great questions, great things to ponder. And in that sense, it's it creates introspection for anybody who you're not going to read this and not come up with like questions and ideas and ooh, it would be neat to. But it's nowhere close to being a toolkit or a how-to or anything like that. It doesn't guide you towards it. It just tells you. And, as we've seen, and I was just thinking to myself, when we did that review of the Modron March Classic Adventure. It's an adventure that when you think of the concept of it, you think, oh, this is going to be amazing. We are traveling the planes, seeing all that they have to answer. The realms of myth, and mystery are going to come alive. And then you actually look at the words on the page, and it's so boring. It's so everyday. You could be anywhere for a lot of these encounters, and they aren't myth and mystery and wild changes. They feel like you could be anywhere. So why are we in the plains if we're not going to do this? And how do I avoid having that problem happen? Because here we are, many years forward from that time. So how do I make that really, really jump out? And this chapter doesn't really have that.
Yeah. What does it cover? Well, it covers the material plane and its two sort of echo planes, the Shadowfell and the Feywild. It talks about the transitive planes, the astral plane that leads to the outer planes, and then the ethereal, which leads to the inner planes. The inner planes being the elemental planes, and the outer planes being those areas that are sectioned off by the gods that rule them, and the alignments that, let me say, align with their sort of ethos. They also then talk about like the positive energy and the negative energy plane. It discusses the alternate systems and how you can put them together, like the Great Wheel, the World Tree, the World Axis, and then others that include some other campaign settings. What were your sort of overall thoughts on that chapter?
It's 26 pages. And I guess a question worth asking is, should the DMG be covering this information? And to what extent, right? If we need 26 pages on the planes, then I think these are beautiful, but they're not that toolkit guide and should be that. If the answer is no, we don't need 26 pages on the planes, then this should be like 2 pages summarizing just what you need, and some other book can cover this. And let's get back to actual common useful things that a DM really needs to know, because I've played long enough that I have been to the plains lots of times, but it is far less important to those experiences what someone knew about the plains, and rather what someone knew about DMing and good DMing, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
And in fact, I had to write a planar adventure, or sort of planar, demi-planar. I had to go to an air node for one of the Adventures League adventures I wrote. And when I looked at this chapter, and as a writing assignment, I found a few ideas, that generalize what the plane of air is like, but nothing that really helped me craft an adventure for it. And then I went on and looked at old editions, and one of them was like, there is a planar node in the classic adventure Temple of Elemental Evil. It's literally just an area of a rocky cavern with air creatures in it. There's nothing to it. And a lot of what I looked at was like that. There was really nothing there that really told me, here's how to make an awesome elemental experience. And so if you're not going to give me that, I don't know that this chapter should be in here, or at least in this form.
Right. I had a similar situation with Living Forgotten Realms. There was an epic, I think, or whatever, interactive, whatever you want to call it, that was a race. There is a famous race in the Forgotten Realms. In what's the desert area? Oh boy, I had it just a second ago.
Kalimshan, right?
Kalimshan, right. There was a race through Kalimshan, like through the desert. And so that was what the 1st through 10th level characters did. What they call the heroic tier. 11 through 20 is the Paragon tier in 4th edition. And they also had characters that were that level. So we're like, what do? We didn't want to put them in this regular race because they can teleport and they can do all sorts of things. So we set this race. This was a multiplanar race. This was an elemental chaos race. And so this is going to then, but we didn't want to do, okay, you just make animal handling checks, right, to control your mount, and that's it. So we threw all of these weird and strange challenges that would only happen within the elemental chaos, within this multiplanar area. And these planar adventures, as Teos has been saying, should not be just your typical adventure, but just in this other plane. You should be high enough. You should tailor it to high-level characters so that they have to use resources just to survive. They should be having to cast high-level spells just to be able to breathe, just to be able to navigate, just to walk through this area. Then you can figure out how your encounters are going to be cool, but it does need to be different. And if it's not different, you may as well just set it in Kalimshan.
Right.
Yeah. That's my thought.
100%. And it's like, why does this chapter not help with any of that? Because that's, to me, what you'd want to come to this book for.
Yeah. And I want your second option, right? I want 4 pages about these are the planes, and here's two sentences on each. Something to make them mythical. Something that if the player reads, they'll be like, that sounds cool. But don't tell them anything else about it. Don't tell them that in order to survive there, you need to do these things. Let their characters learn that. And now I want my big manual of the planes book as the dungeon master, right? Because my players are less likely to buy that than the dungeon master's guide. Then you can do the full explanation. Plus, and I was saving this for last, but it's going to be perfect to bring up now, have the story elements that are going to make good campaigns and good adventures and good encounters, and have the rules element that brings all of this together. So in the Abyss, characters are taking 1d6 points of psychic damage every turn or every round, unless they have a protection from good and evil spell going. So even going in there, you better have a high enough level caster to cast that for everybody in your party, and or have scrolls of it made before you go, or find a way to survive that. Then we can get on with quote unquote normal adventuring, even though it won't be normal.
And it's interesting to see that in this book, they tend to have a number of sort of very predictable, repeating kind of approaches to how each of these planes works, which I think actually takes away from their magic. And then they have these optional rules that come with no guidance as to how to work with them and create big problems, right? And the approach you said of like, say, damage every round is something that we saw in like that first edition manual of the planes. You'd be like, this plane is on fire. You are in the plane of elemental fire, and you're some hellish plane. You're going to take damage unless you have protection against fire, right? And this sort of says, well, your mind might get taken over by the plane, but doesn't tell you how to really work with that. I found that was very interesting and disappointing.
Yeah. So that was the sort of overall talk about the planes in this chapter. Then they get into specific things. The first is planar travel. They talk about planar portals, spells that allow you to travel between the planes. What did you think of that section in general?
This is another example where it's like, yeah, cool, I can use astral projection or gate or plane shift, but like, or portal. So cool. What should I actually do as DM? What are the recommendations? What has played out well across the years of D&D? What should I watch for? How does it vary by PC level what I should choose? And there's nothing here really indicating that. And that's a real loss.
Yeah. It's odd because they talk about spells like gate and spells like plane shift, and they sort of put limits on the spells, but the player should know this when they learn the spell. Otherwise, as we talked about in the earlier section, the DM turns into the bad guy. The DM, the player hits a level so they can cast plane shift, and they're like, okay, cool. Now we're going to go rescue this NPC who was carted off to the first level of hell. And the DM has to say, well, you know what? I know it's in the small print of this, but you need a planar fork that is tied specifically to that plane, and you don't just have those. You sort of have to
Yeah.
find one of those or make one of those. And gate is similar, right? In the spell, it sounds like you can just go. But
Right.
then the dungeon master guy's like, well, you can't really just do that. You need to this and you need to that. And it's setting up this discrepancy between what the player thinks is going to happen and what the dungeon master and these rules in the dungeon master's guide know is going to happen.
Yeah. And then it goes into the planes and Astral and Ethereal kind of crack me up because they're so similar. And we'll see this in Feywild and Shadowfell. It's like, okay, you have these two planes that border the prime, and the Astral is the realm of thought and dream, and the Ethereal is this kind of ghostly almost overlay of the plane. And outside of a few differences, they function very similarly. And I found that kind of lame, right? Like with the astral plane, you can get there by the astral projection spell or a plane shift or a rare portal. They don't tell you what happens. I mean, the astral projection spell tells you, but they don't really mention what happens when you go through a portal, which is that your body will end up on the other side. And I thought that is an important thing to tell the DM. You can find color pools that lead to the outer planes based on their color. In the ethereal plane, the version of that is you find curtains of color that lead to the different inner planes based on their color. In the astral plane, you have a psychic wind, which is a storm that can blow you off course. You have an ether cyclone on the ethereal plane. And I just kind of had to laugh of like, I don't know, like it's fine, but it's a lot of words to have in chapter 2 and with very few tips on how to make this really awesome. There's a short paragraph with ideas for encounters, but they're just such baseline concepts that none of it is close to being anything like a drop in or how do I make it interesting on the astral plane. And there's nothing there like that.
And this shows the weight of previous editions and previous lore weighing down the next edition. Because as a developer, as a designer, what do you, I have to make the new rules for planes. What do? I go back and look at first edition, second edition, third edition, fourth edition. It's all convoluted. There's changes, there's things, but I have to keep it. I have to use these color pools because that's cool and they're color. And you don't get the chance, especially if it's a hurried book, as we heard this was, to be able to say, okay, all this lore is cool. How is it going to work in the game?
Yeah.
And we may need to redesign this. We may need to change this to make it best for the players and the DMs who are telling their stories within this setting that we're building.
Yeah.
So we had the ethereal plane, the astral plane. We get the Feywild and Shadowfell. Now these are newer additions to the editions, but they are the sort of shadows or the bright and the dark that are in the background that sort of support the material plane. So the Feywild gets the description, as we've seen over and over, as it being sort of the positive energy, ultra vibrant Fey realm, whereas the Shadowfell is the twisted, gray, dark, warped version of our world. So the Feywild is where the Fey creatures live, where the Fey lords, the Fey kings and queens live, whereas Shadowfell is the home of the domains of dread and that sort of thing.
This is another example.
It's been done before. Yeah.
This is another example of where, like, having played a lot of great adventures in the Feywild and Shadowfell, and then played some not so great ones, there are real tips as to how do you make these feel that should be in this book, right? Like why you use the Feywild and why you use the Shadowfell. It's entirely different storytelling, and how you make those things really work. You want to lean into certain elements of those planes for certain kinds of experiences, and there's nothing here that really helps you create that. And maybe for something like the Feywild, you might go and open up Witchlight and get an example of it, but there's nothing here telling you how to create that, and that's a real shame because that's what makes it such a difference. And if you don't use this with purpose and with an understanding of what one can achieve with them, then you're gonna have a lackluster experience, right? And your players will.
Right. You have the tendency either to underdo it and make it feel like just another adventure that could be anywhere, or overdo it and make it so the story might be really interesting and the setting may be way out there and attention grabbing, but then the game starts to suffer because of it. And you need to see that balance. You need to see both the story side and the rules side to know how far you can push both directions.
Yep, absolutely.
We hear about the inner planes and the outer planes, the inner planes being the elemental planes. We get a description of each, including some locations and features within them. So the plane of Earth has a Tao living in the City of Jewels. There's furnaces near the plane of fire, the swamp of oblivion, and the plane of water, etc. And then where two elemental planes meet, there is sort of a para-elemental plane. So you get the mud plane, you get the steam plane, and those sorts of things, which are really cool and really fun to use when used correctly.
Yeah.
But again, we don't get a description of how to use it correctly.
On the inner planes, there's also this nice sense of when you're closer to the prime, it's more hospitable. And then when it's further away, it becomes the elemental chaos. That's a really nice concept that they've fine-tuned from after 3rd edition, which I like a lot because it gives you that latitude of a little more latitude than, say, the 1st edition manual planes, which was when you transport yourself to the plane of Earth, you might show up in solid Earth. Like, okay, I guess we're all dead.
Which is bad for you. It's good for your skin. It's good
yeah.
for your skin. It's bad for your internal organs.
Yeah, eventually you become a diamond, so there's great. But yeah, then the outer planes these are 16 main planes of deities and powerful entities, and the distinction that's made here is these are lands that are steeped in those powerful entities and organized according to alignment. So each of the 16 planes is an alignment, and each plane is effectively infinite. The travel time is completely up to the deities there / the GM. And some planes have layers, so each is sort of a microplane underneath it, also effectively infinite, that can extend the experience. And you can get there via an astral projection and a color pool, if you went through the astral, or a plane shift spell, or some portal that exists. They talk about the city. The City of Doors has portals leading to all these various places. The river Styx weaves through all the evil planes. The infinite staircase may mysteriously have doors that open onto it and allow access between planes. And then each plane has optional rules about that whole idea of the plane will eventually change you. It might even transform you or make you not want to leave. It's all lovely lore. It's often very evocative, but nothing here that really teaches me how to make a planar adventure. And I worry that a lot of this will lead to that sort of, Modron March type result where somewhere up in some DM's or author's brain is the idea that this is amazing, but in practicality, it's just a normal experience.
Yep. And finally, we get to the other planes. They talk about the Outlands and Sigil, being the Sigil being the city of Planescape. It's a torus around a huge mountain. We get a little bit of information on demiplanes, which can be as tiny as a chamber or as enormous as an infinite demiplane. They can be naturally created or created artificially by spells. And then talk about the far realm, which is outside the known universe, and there are no known portals to it, and we wouldn't even know what to do if we entered the far realm, because it is supposedly unknowable and unfathomable, and who knows. We also get a small description of the known worlds, so the material worlds, material planes, Toril from Forgotten Realms, Earth. Earth from Greyhawk, Kryn from Dragonlance, Athos, of course, from a favorite setting of ours, Dark Sun, Eberron being from Eberron, Birthright, Mystara, those are all named. And so that ends part 1. Next time we will get into part 2, chapter 3, where we can talk about being the master of adventures. So overall, what were our thoughts on chapter 2? I'm going to answer that first, Teos. I'm going to tell you that I bet if I started with 5th edition, I would open this Dungeon Master's Guide and I would read this chapter and I would be so excited. I would be like, I'm going to run adventures here. I'm going to set adventures here. I don't know how I'm going to, but boy, I'm going to. But since I've been reading the same stuff since 1st edition, it loses that initial coolness. And it's just now I'm a game designer and I want to know if I'm running or writing an adventure that takes place on the 4th level of hell, what should I keep in mind? Both story-wise and mechanically.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, there's some neat things, like when you look at like the planar landscape, right? That's cool, and to sit there and think through how this edition has taken a particular, look at it is neat. But yeah, I agree with you. There's not much here that's tool-based. And I worry that while this may be inspirational, I suspect that today's readers want it done differently. Otherwise, they're going to catch this on YouTube. So you have to make it more useful and less encyclopedic. And I just think the game is moving away from that. And has been for a long time, right? Like, and I've talked about this before. Like there's such a difference between telling me what the history of the Cult of the Dragon is and telling me what to do with the Cult of the Dragon. And you only really need a few ideas on what the Cult of the Dragon is to then take like actual cool things that I can drop in and run with that, right? I don't need pages of the history of Sandmaster or anything like that. Like, just give me what they're up to and some neat ideas, hooks, and I'm off. Like, let's make an adventure, right?
Yep. Yeah. So we'll see what happens in chapter 3 to maybe bring some useful information to dungeon masters who are actually creating their own adventures or using published adventures in a certain way. So with that, I will say thank you to all of our listeners out there, whether you listen on YouTube or via a podcast, or if you are in tune with us in a way, a telepathic way, and you listen via just your brain cells. We appreciate that. We have 3 tiers to our Patreon, though. So if you would like to become a supporter of the show, you have 3 choices. You could be the Master of Dungeons, and we thank our Master of Dungeon supporters for helping us out. You could be a Master of the Realms. If you're a Master of the Realms, we put your name or your company in our show notes that everybody who's a patron can see. But if you are a Master of the Multiverse, well, you get a special shout out on the show. And those include Keith Amon, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Evil John, Darren Chandler, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Chad Lynch, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Eric Mengi, The Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, whose question we used today, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Krishna Simone, say it or don't, Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you so much. If you like the show, please do consider becoming a patron. You can go to our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Also, if you get a chance, leave us a review either on YouTube or subscribe on YouTube. Leave us some comments, or you can review us on Apple Podcasts or via whatever means you use to listen to this podcast. So, Teos, what you been up to and where can people find you on the socials?
Oh, find me at alphastream.org. From there, you can find my latest Success in RPGs video and all the other good stuff I'm doing. Where do we find you, Shawn?
I am still on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, and so is the podcast at Mastering DND. We're also on Mastodon, the show at Dice Camp, and me at Tabletop Social. And of course, we have our Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel where you can subscribe, leave comments, ask questions, etc. So, Teos, we are through our tour of the planes. So, what are we going to do now?
Well, it's really obvious what we're going to do in real life, which is we're going to go off and create our new DM's Guild supplement on 120 golf bags that you can use to carry around your new weapons. That's what I'm going to do with my free time.
Yeah, and I'm going to do, the planar guide to planes, plainly.